Welcome to the Apex Sunday podcast, hosted by myself, Robert Ross, and John Dowsett. And today we're discussing the Spanish Grand Prix for MotoGP. I think the story of qualifying was Marquez again failing to get out of Q1. It's obviously a bit of an issue with him adapting to this Ducati from 10, 11 years on a Honda, and it may be costing him victories. And I guess the other big story of qualifying...
Do you think that's the case? Do you think it's a change in machinery that he's doing that? Because I mean, he sure can let it go during the race. So,
well, he said he's having a hard time with fresh tires, and by the time he works them in, they're too worn out to get the ultimate one lap qualifying speed. And he says the front keeps tucking on him. So it's interesting that his new engineer, Frankie Carcetti, a few years ago, he was the engineer for Joan Mir, who won the 2020, or is it the 2021, one of those years championship. And he said that qualifying has always been his engineering weakness. But we'll see if that continues with Mark. But I think once Mark is able to qualify well, every other rider is in a lot of trouble when that happens, based on what we've seen recently. We had Aleix announce his retirement. He's been in MotoGP for over 20 years. I remember years ago when coverage of MotoGP in Canada is not good, to say the least. I remember seeing a race just offhand years ago and hearing that name, Aleix Espargaro. And I love the name Aleix. It's not a name that we have in English, and it's not Alex exactly. But he retired, but he got pole on this weekend. And as we saw, he won the sprint. So that was interesting to watch. And Raul Fernandez, who finished second a couple of years ago in the Moto2 championship, he got his third place reinstated after a little bit of a mix-up with a penalty. And then Binder. At the beginning of the season, I thought Binder could sneak into the championship with consistency. Unfortunately, he's very consistent with binning his bike all the time. Lots of crashes in practice and in qualifying. Still qualified fairly well, but it's too late now. The top three are just way ahead of everyone in the championship. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on qualifying? Or
it was fun to watch it. I was shocked at how poorly Marquez did. Mark Marquez did. I expected more. And he looked like he was comfortable on the bike. It looked like he was getting hitting the limits, and clearly he wasn't.
No.
So yeah, but it was nice seeing Aleix doing what he did.
Yes.
I mean,
in the Aprilia,
solid rider.
Now the sprint, I'd say the big story is the three leaders crashing out one after the other. Raul, Binder, and Pecco on the last lap in turn 5. The other story was Aleix getting a win just after his retirement. And of course, Mark coming from 14th to 2nd yet again. And then the rookie sensation, Pedro Acosta, being the top KTM and getting another podium. So, and the other story I would say is Martin, when he had a reputation, I thought it was not fair that he would do too much to try to save a race if he wasn't on the podium or to win. So he finished 4th in the sprint from 7th on the grid. Mm-hmm. But, he's for including the race, he lost only 1 point of his championship lead this entire event. So I thought he had a great ride, even if he finished 4th.
Showing some maturity.
Mm-hmm.
Showing some maturity. And again, the right person won the race. Using a cool head, knowing what he was doing, being patient, and patience paid off. And it's, the exuberance that took out the top three, and they were all just trying to have a gap. So they didn't have a challenge at the end of the race. And that's just silly. You don't have to do that.
Well, it's funny how you have to, like you said before, you see the gaps come down a lot in these races, and that's what it's all about. It's about managing it until to try to cross the finish line first. And that's what Aleix did this time. So great for him. And again, Mark, how does he do it? Like, he just keeps doing it and doing it. It's just incredible.
He
So
knows when to get on it and when not to. Yeah, it's as simple as that, right? I mean, you could see him biding his time. Like he wasn't getting anxious, thinking he had
in
to
a
get by
sprint.
somebody. Yes,
Hmm.
in a sprint
Yeah.
too, which is
Yeah.
incredible. What
Hmm.
what this reminded me of was the Tour de France, and you see it all the time
Mm.
in the Tour de France, where some rider's going to sprint off early in the race, and think they're going to have this huge gap, and therefore the peloton isn't going to catch them, and they're going to win,
Right.
and they always get caught. Well, in this
Right.
case, the top three guys. I mean, my God, it's just
Hmm.
and it's shocking to see it. Yeah,
Yeah, it's funny to see Pecco's bike upside down completely in the gravel.
yeah.
But for rider of the race, even though Aleix won during his retirement, I have to give it to Mark. What about you?
I have to give it to Aleix. I mean, having that kind of patience in the sprint,
Mm.
having that kind of patience to do what he did. It's a sprint race. What are you supposed to do in a sprint race? You're
All
supposed
out,
to,
right?
right? I mean, it's a
Yeah.
short race. You get it done, and yeah, just really, really, really smart riding.
What about rating the race? What would you give it, or the sprint race?
Well, if the top three guys hadn't been complete boneheads in what they were doing, it would be way higher up in the scale. But at the same time, there were some wonderful things, so I'd have to give it a solid 6.5.
Right. I'm going to give it a 7, even though the 3 guys fell out. I think the margin is so thin that it happens, and Pecco recovered the next day in the race. So I'm going to give it a 7. All right, so let's move on to the race. And for the race, what I just mentioned, the story was Pecco wins after the disappointment of the sprint.
Yes.
And again, Martin from 7th to 2nd. He only loses 1 point of his lead. And once he realized he couldn't beat Pecco, he just stayed on the bike and brought home points.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Marquez from 14th to 3rd. Again, he does this. But also, I think one of the big stories with Enea, and we talked about this last race where you thought that his penalty wasn't deserved, and he thought his penalty this time wasn't deserved, and he ignored the long lap penalty, the double long lap
Yes.
penalty.
Yes.
And I thought that was a wonderful way to protest what's going on with penalties and judgment, which is a thing that affects a lot of motorsports at the moment. I know it affects F1 for sure. And I thought, that was a great way to say, basically give the finger to to the rules makers and say, we've got to discuss this. We've got to, why am I getting penalized when I went off course and I lost some time anyways, and I lost the position, I gave it back. And I read that they base the time that you're supposed to lose 1 second. It's based on the average time for that sector. And there's just no way that these riders can figure that out live in time without any radio or anything.
Not a chance.
So great for Enea to do that. Hopefully it helps. Don't know if it'll help. Usually the rules people are not too fond of being shown up that way, but I thought it was a great thing for him to do. What did you think?
Well, I'm relatively new to this sport, but I agree. The penalty was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I really, really like the way that penalties are meted out in this sport, and that it's, just you're riding a little bit farther. And,
Yeah, the long lap penalty is a great way to.
Fantastic.
Yeah, they should introduce that to cars as well.
They should introduce that in all motorsport, as far as I'm concerned, because it's brilliant. How much time do you figure that the long lap loses them?
It depends on the course. Sometimes it's just over a second. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 seconds, but it does lose them time. They can't go over the lines or anything, so they have to be careful going through it. And it doesn't destroy their race from like a small mistake or a small off, whereas other times your race gets destroyed for almost nothing. So, yeah.
So now you've got a penalty. You don't serve your penalty by doing the long lap. And what's the result?
So then they gave him a double and then they gave him 30 seconds at the end.
Right, but what's the result? I mean, if it's going to knock you back, it's ridiculous.
People argued against Aeneas doing it, saying, well, if you'd just taken the penalty, because apparently they can't be appealed, if you'd taken the penalty, then he still would have scored points. But at this point, I don't think he's really concerned about that. He's probably going to lose his ride with the main team anyways, and he just had to make a point.
It goes deeper than that, though, doesn't it, with the penalty? Because now you've got to answer to your team as to why you didn't do that and why it hurt you that badly. And now what other team is going to say, oh, I want him. Well, hang on a second. Wait, did you see what he did when he didn't take his penalty and he got a 30-second penalty and was completely out of the points?
Yeah, well, Ducati said they didn't mind what he did. And I think that it's the riders that smash into people all the time and do all, it has to be really bad for them to not to care that much. If the rider's a good rider, they'll want him. And I think it's the same with F1. We've seen, the McLaren Ferrari thing, and Alonso was somewhat involved in that. We've seen
to the point where Max gets the nickname Verkrashen.
Yeah, so if the rider's going to get you results more often than not, then they'll just turn away from that kind of thing. So for the rider of the race, I'm going to give it to Martin. Again, I think he did a wonderful job protecting his lead. And if Pecco is unable to improve his sprint performances, and if Mark is unable to improve his qualifying, they will not be able to beat Martin this year. But if they can, then it'll be a three-way race all the way to the end of the championship.
Nice.
Who's your rider of the race?
Oh, it's Marquez.
Yeah.
To go from 14th to 3rd.
He's always impressive.
The first few are easy. The first few are easy. He's a great starter and just doesn't get out of it. And that's the first rule of racing, is you just don't get out of it. There are two trains of thought. One is, just take it easy, and that way you're going to you aren't going to fall into the melee of the first lap. And then there's the other people that just keep your wrist into it, and away we go. And that's what he does. And so you can take 3 or 4 of those out of there, because he's a great starter. But then to work his way through, oh my God. Now, granted, there were 3, 3 moments that you look at him in the race, and unfortunately I didn't write them down, but there were a few moments in the race where he did things that I just looked at and went, wow. Yeah.
It's great to see, these top racers still in the modern era, still racing like they should, right? It's just amazing.
Yes.
So, and the other thing is, I'm from the stiff upper lip British culture. The Italians and the Spanish sure know how to celebrate, don't they?
Yeah, no kidding.
It's just great to see. I mean, it lifts up the whole team, and everyone is, because it's not just the riders, it's the entire team. There's a lot of people working to get this kind of success. So why not celebrate it as much as you can? And just such
and the audience loves it.
They do.
Loves it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, how would you rate this race?
About a 3.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it a 6, because it's not to the same quality that we're used to. I think it's a little bit unfair because the margins were a lot larger than usual from, the top 5 at least.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the kind of expectation this sport has been setting. So sometimes we're going to get races like this when the top 5 aren't super, super close. But I enjoyed the race.
Spoiled. I got spoiled by the sprint. That's all it is.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on to the news. And one thing is with Aleix retiring, there's a seat available at Aprilia. Enea is often said to be a shoe-in for that if Ducati doesn't want him in the main team. They talk about Marco Bezzecchi from VR46, who finished 3rd in the championship last year on the Ducati GP22. This year he's on the 23 and he's having a hard time adapting to it, but obviously they think he still hasn't lost any of his speed. He just needs more time to adapt. This is again where Marquez stands out, coming from a totally different bike, competing with Pecco and Martin, who've been on Ducatis for at least 4 years or more. He's a standout rider. The Indian Grand Prix has been canceled and moved to the beginning of next season, if it happens at all. They raced for the first time last season at the Bode International Circuit, which the F1 guys used to race on. I really liked that circuit. We had a great race there last season, but it was so hot that Jorge Martin almost passed out at the end of it. So moving it to the beginning of the year, it won't be, 40, 50 degrees in their leathers.
Right.
And Repsol Honda, this is their last year of Repsol sponsoring Honda after 30 years in the sport. I don't really care about sponsors in a sentimental way, like Repsol Honda. Everyone knows that name. When I talked to Chuck about watching MotoGP, he asked me 2 questions. Is Repsol Honda still there? And is Valentino Rossi still there? And they had Freddie Spencer, Wayne Gardner, Mick Doohan, Alex Crivier, Valentino Rossi, Nicky Hayden, Casey Stoner, and Marc Marquez are all Repsol Honda champions. So it is big news, but they're moving out of sponsoring Honda. They still want to be involved with the biofuels. That's 100% by 2027. This year it's 40%. Mm-hmm. So that's about all the news that I can think of. Anything you want to add?
I think it's sad. I mean, mm-hmm. The only other longer sponsorship I can think of is Shell with Ferrari.
Right.
Or AGIP, just.
Well, what's the Lowe's hairpin called now? And was that a sponsorship on the hairpin in Monaco?
I don't think so.
Because that's what I know it as. Yes. And I know sometimes they rename corners and tracks after riders or drivers.
Yes.
And if it's called Turn 7 or something, sure. But I heard that at Monza, they renamed the Parabolica after Michele Alboreto. Now, nothing against Alboreto, but it's always going to be the Parabolica to me.
Yeah.
So next up, we have Mugello. Again, I mentioned last time the 2019 Mugello race was one of my favorites I've ever seen. So I'm hoping for a great race there. Mugello is also Mark's first Grand Prix win in the 125 class. And I don't know if you caught it, but apparently someone has found out that the 27th win of Ducati was won by Casey Stoner with bike number 27. The 63rd was won by Pecco when he has 63 when he doesn't have number 1. The 89th was won by Martin, who has 89. So if it's the 93rd race, if Mark wins this, that'll come into being. I'm not into numerology or anything, but I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
So, all right.
That's sort of like that. That's sort of like Beards and Stanley Cup playoffs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mugello's next, and then we have a 3-week break, and we'll talk to you soon after Mugello. Thanks, John.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Bye.